afternoon. My name's Dave Norton from Discovering New England History, and we're going to begin a new series here on the Alamo in Texas. And now you're going to be asking me probably, why are we doing it on Texas? It's not New England, but yes, it is. My wife and I went down there and we visited Texas and went through the entire Alamo and went through the library, and they were very helpful for me. And three of the defenders of the Alamo were all from New England. Actually, there are a few more than that, but these three here are always discussed in Alamo history. So now we're going to bring it to you as part of New England history. You've got Captain Albert Martin, and the ages I put are the ages that they were when they fell at the Alamo. He was 28, and he's from Rhode Island. Corporal Gordon Jennings, he was 56. He was the oldest Alamo defender, and he's from Connecticut. And Dr. Amos Pollard, 33, was born in Massachusetts. So we're going to have this story, a little bit of different perspective of how these folks came to the Alamo. So we'll go to the next slide. And I took this picture here, which I think is representative. And Dr. Amos Pollard, he was the chief surgeon at the Alamo. And he's from Massachusetts. And that's a portrait of him on the right. And that's how I discovered it. When I did the tour of the Alamo, I saw this portrait, and I asked the tour guide, who was that? And he said, oh, that's Dr. Amos Pollard from Massachusetts. Amazing. He was the chief surgeon. He set up the hospital at the Alamo. We'll go to the next slide. Now I had to do some research, which was somewhat difficult because actually a lot of the folks in New England don't even realize the significance of the Alamo to New England. Amos Pollard was born in Ashburnham, Massachusetts, 1803. And that's kind of a picture there of what the town looked like back in the day. Just a small town. And that's where we're going to cover each one of these three defenders. First story will be Amos Pollard. So we'll go to the next slide. Now, his family relocated when he was very young to Surrey, New Hampshire. And that's where he grew up as a child. And of course, that's a wonderful country up in there. And a great picture I took on the right was actually Main Street in Surrey, New Hampshire, back in the early 1800s. And we'll go to the next slide. Now, he was very, very intelligent, and he wanted to be a doctor. And I found out that he went to a place called Castleton Medical College, which is in Castleton, Vermont. And I wanted to get an idea of where these folks are from. And there's a church that's still there. And of course, there's a countryside on the right. Basically what it would look like in the early 1800s. And that was one of the, I guess, one of the first medical colleges in the country. It's very, very well known. And we'll go to the next slide. Now, he graduated, became a doctor of medicine in 1825, Castleton, Vermont. And I wanted to get an idea a little bit of what typical houses would look back. And this house here on the left was constructed back there in the day in the early 1800s. And on the right, that building is still there, and that's the only thing actually left from the original Castleton Medical College. So Dr. Amos Pollard, if you see that building or ever visit there, that's where he did a lot of his, probably a lot of his studying. And we'll go to the next slide. Now, where did he go his internship? I did the trace on that, and he did his medical residency for quite a few years at East Greenbush Hospital, which is in New York. And that's an actual picture of it there on the right. And that's an actual portrait of him on the left. And we'll go into that. And he's one of only 4 Alamo defenders that they actually had portraits made before the attack on the Alamo. So that's exactly what he looks like. So we're fortunate to have that picture for New England's history. And we'll go to the next slide. Now, for some reason, he traveled to New Orleans after he got his doctorate in medicine, traveled to New Orleans, was there a short time, and a lot of this background, you'd have to do some more research to really find out what was his circumstances. But anyway, here we are in New Orleans, and basically that was a booming industry back there. And we'll go to the next slide. And then he relocated to Gonzales, Texas in 1835, which was a year before the attack on the Alamo. And that's a typical house there. It was a community set up in Texas. There were several communities back in the day where a lot of folks came in from all over the country. They fell on hard times. They didn't know what to do, and they all moved to Texas for a better opportunity. And that's an actual picture of one of the houses there in the 1800s. You can see that over on the right. And that's about 80 miles away from the Alamo. And we'll go to the next slide. Now, the next one we're going to go speak about is Gordon Jennings. He was 56 years old when he died at the Alamo. And that's a picture of him. Now, he was in artillery. And you can see him standing right there. That's just a representative. We don't have an actual picture of him. Gordon Jennings. But a lot of folks in the Alamo history speak a lot about him. So we'll go to the next slide. And he was born, of all places, Windham, Connecticut in 1780. And on the right there is a picture of what Windham, Connecticut looked back. And you can see they had dirt roads, and it was kind of out in the country. And on the left is a typical house in Windham, Connecticut. And that's where Gordon Jennings was born. We'll go to the next slide. Now, he uprooted and he relocated to St. Louis, Missouri in 1803. And that's a great picture down there. It's, you can see St. Louis, Missouri. You can see all the waterways there and all the different riverboats. You can see just clustered with different houses and everything, and it was really, really quite an industrial site back in 1803. And I guess he was looking for his fortune there in Missouri, decided to go west, just like a lot of other Americans did back in the early 1800s when a lot of the economy was changing. We'll go to the next slide. Now, to give you an idea, why in the world would they go to Texas? Well, in 1824 now, Texas was open to new settlers. What we know as Texas today was Mexico. And the problem was they had all the Native Americans were in that particular area. And Mexico were interested to have that resettled. And so they opened up all their lands to anyone that would want to come and settle there. And you could get a lot of land grants, a lot of it very, very, very cheap. And there it was, the movement was on. You can see in the bottom there, they all would come over with covered wagons and all their belongings, and they'd probably set up a small cabin like that. But you had certain requirements. Now, you got to remember, we're in Mexico. And the requirements for settlement was, one, they had to become American citizens. They had to renounce that they were from America. Number two, they had to convert to Catholicism. And most of them that came there, I did some research, were all Protestants. But they did it. And number three, you couldn't have any slavery there, which was interesting because now we're getting close to the Civil War period in a few years. And of course, the problems with slavery, and when Americans wanted to expand and go west, some of them wanted to continue the practice of slavery. Number four, they had to work hard and be productive. The idea was they had to settle there, they had to stay there, grow their own crops, and really get squared away in that area. And then five, they had to obey all Mexican laws. And that's the flag of Mexico up there, and that's a lot of settlers were moving to Texas. So we'll go to the next slide. Now, Gordon Jennings, of course, we saw before, he was in New Orleans, and for some reason he relocated to Austin, Texas. And he went to Austin, he joined part of what they call the Stephen F. Austin Colony in 1833. Stephen F. Austin set up a colony there where all these folks from New England would go when they would set up their homes and everything else, and they were starting to expand out in Texas. And that was the whole idea. That's what the Mexican government wanted, all these Americans to go and become citizens of Mexico, form towns, be productive, and keep out all the raiding North American Indians that were in that particular area. Mexico didn't have the resources to do that. So we'll go to the next slide. Now, in 1834, it's 2 years before the Alamo, Gordon Jennings joined the militia in Austin, Texas. And the head of the militia in Austin, Texas, was a fellow that everyone knows, Colonel William Barrett Travis. So Gordon Jennings from Connecticut, being probably the oldest soldier that he had, and also in artillery, was great friends with William Barrett Travis. And they were in a Texas militia. And of course, there's a famous cannon right in front there, and give you an idea what Gordon Jennings was familiar with. And we'll go to the next slide. So we've covered two of the Alamo defenders, and the third was from Rhode Island, Providence, Rhode Island, a gentleman by the name of Albert Martin. And that's sort of a, on the right there, sort of a representation of what he looked like. An artist did that. There's, as far as I know, there's no actual portrait of him back in the day. So we'll go to the next slide. And we all start here with the Martin House, which is in Swansea, Massachusetts, constructed in 1728. And that's where the Martin family had a big farm, and all their family, that's where a lot of them grew up. And that starts this New England story here in Swansea, Massachusetts. And that house is still there. It's open for tours. We'll go to the next slide. Then the family moved to, his father's name was Joseph Martin. They moved to Providence on Benefit Street, Providence, Rhode Island. And that's where Albert Martin was born in 1808. And that house is still there. And we'll go to the next slide. Now, what was Providence like back there? Joseph Martin was a merchant, Albert's father. In the 1800s, there's a picture of what Providence looked like. You can imagine that all the ships coming into the port of Providence, all the ships bringing goods and a lot of trading, and it was quite a center of trade back there in the early 1800s. And we'll go to the next slide. And this was really the center where all the shops were all set up, all the warehouses were. It's called Market Square, Providence, Rhode Island. And that's a great sketch, and you can see how busy it was. All these ships would dock in Providence from all over the world, and all their goods would be for sale down here. And Joseph Martin really prospered and really did very well back then. And we'll go to the next slide. And that's a picture. That's kind of a neat picture there. The downtown Providence. What did it look like in the 1800s? You can see the horse and buggy, idea. It was had large houses and whatever for a lot of the workers around the docks, and that whole industry. That's basically, it was really busy down in Providence, Rhode Island. We'll go to the next slide. Now, Albert, very smart, wanted a real good education, and his father sent him to and he applied for and got accepted at what they call the American Literary, Scientific, and Military Academy, and that was Middletown, Connecticut, of all places. And it was under, the founder was Captain Alden Partridge, and that's his picture right there. And he was West Point graduate, and he founded this school here. And all instructions in military and in engineering and artillery and everything that's involved that was taught here is a military academy, very strict, and that's where Albert Martin went. Now, what I did there on the right, I got a picture of what it looked like back in the day. And down below, I took another picture and sort of compare it what it looks like today. And I said, gee, that looks awful familiar on the site, and did some research. And those buildings on the bottom there are still there today. And it's part of what we now know as Wesleyan University, Middletown, Connecticut. And that's where Albert Martin got all his military training. We'll go to the next slide. And this is a close-up. The American Literary, Scientific, and Military Academy. That's where his education began, and he came down there to Middletown when he was 18 years old. And after 3 or 4 years here, he graduated with a lot of skills that a lot of folks back there in the day did not have. And that building is still there today. We'll go to the next slide. And that's the type of uniform they had. And you got to remember, this was 1821 when he graduated, approximately 1821. And the uniforms that they had were very similar to those that they had in the War of 1812, which had really only happened a few years earlier than that. So that's a picture on the left of what the cadets at the military academy, that's what they had. And there's another close-up of the church and the other buildings where I'm sure Albert Martin spent some long hours in studying military history and engineering and all types of things. Very good school. Go to the next slide. Now, what happened is the family, Joseph Martin, all of a sudden things started a downturn in the economy in Providence. All of a sudden, the whole idea of being a merchant and with ships coming from all over the world, it just wasn't working out for the Martin family. And they were really, really in tough straits. So Albert Martin, he decided to relocate to New Orleans. And we're trying to go through this story here to see exactly how these 3 Alamo defenders, how in the world did they come from New England to end up in Texas? So we found out that Albert Martin relocated to New Orleans, and his father and brothers had set up a business there because that was very thriving. Providence was not. New Orleans was the place to go to reestablish everything that they had worked for all their lives. So we'll go to the next picture. And this is an idea of where they were. The Joseph Martin family business, New Orleans, 1832. You can see they had a shop right down in New Orleans, and then over on the right is typical of what they would have, a warehouse where they would store all the goods and everything else. It was quite a thriving business, but once again, the economy turned and something had to change with Joseph Martin and his family here. So we'll go to the next slide. And once again, here it comes. Texas, once again, was still open to new settlers in 1824 on. And the family moved to Gonzales, Texas. Now, Mexico requirements, once again, they had to renounce their American citizenship, convert to Catholicism, couldn't have any slavery, work hard and be productive, and obey all Mexican laws. And so up they went to across to Texas and started a settlement right there. So we'll go to the next slide. Now, at this time, 1833, Mexico was going through a change. They had a revolution. Of course, Mexico and that whole area was part of Spain. They broke away, they had independence from Spain. They elected a new president called Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. That's his picture on the lower right. And that's a picture of Mexico City, what it looked like in the early 1800s. And he was I guess you would certainly have to call him a dictator. He took over, and wow, he ruled with a tough iron fist. And one of the problems he had, of course, was up in Texas, because a lot of the Texans now that came and settled there since 1824, they didn't exactly follow all the Mexican rules and that Mexico put out. And not only that, Santa Anna, who was president, he really tightened up all the rules. He increased taxation on them. He shut down a lot of the borders. He wanted to establish his rule in Texas. So we'll go to the next slide. So Captain Albert Martin relocated to Gonzales, Texas, and that's a typical house that they would have had there. That's actually, I guess you could visit that today. It's in Gonzales, Texas. And that's where they moved, and they set up another small business. And then times were changing. So we'll go to the next slide. Now, what happened was Santa Anna wanted to get a cannon back from Gonzales. What had happened in old Mexico, they gave the town of Gonzales an artillery piece, a cannon, to use defense in case of Indian attacks. And Santa Anna and everyone knew that, and he wanted to take that cannon away from those that settled there. They're called Texians, as they called them back then. Now, what happened was he sent a detachment of 100 Mexican soldiers into Gonzales to take the cannon back. And then the city of Gonzales got together, put together a militia, and there were 18 soldiers in it. And they found out that Albert Martin had all his military training, and they made him captain of what they call the Old Gonzales 18. That's why he's a huge part of Texas history. They made their own flag, picture of a cannon on it, the state Lone Star for Texas, and come and take it underneath it. And they got 150 together, and you can see that famous painting down there with the flag. And the captain was in charge of it, Captain Albert Martin. And there's his name. Those are the folks that were from Texas, that actually from all over the United States, or America back then. And he was in charge of that. Very important. And this was called the First Battle of the Texas Revolution. So here we are, a gentleman from Providence, Rhode Island, commanding the Old Gonzales 18 big part of Texas, and he commanded them in this battle. Didn't last very long. And Mexican army just never got the cannon, never pursued that. 2 of their soldiers were killed. Shots were exchanged. None of the Texians were killed. And then Santa Anna was really upset at the fact that this actually happened. So we'll go to the next slide. Now, in the town of Gonzales, Texas, you actually have that on display there on the right, the Come and Take It cannon. You can see it's an antique cannon, and they made some out of wood wheels, and that's what they had there. And they had the cannon on the top, and there it is, 1835, and you can actually go see it today. So you can see that Albert Martin was right there. So if that cannon is a part of history, it's also a part of Rhode Island history. Over on the left, they got this nice, great monument to the Gonzales 18 with Albert Martin's name is engraved on that monument. We'll go to the next slide. So now, I just want to summarize this up. We have these 3 folks, New Englanders, that were defenders at the Alamo. How did they get to Texas? Captain Albert Martin by way of Rhode Island, Connecticut, Louisiana, and in Gonzales, Texas. Corporal Gordon Jennings, how did he get there? He got there basically from Connecticut down to Missouri. He stayed in Missouri quite a few years. A lot of folks think he's a native Missourian, but he's not. And then he made it up to Austin, Texas. And then, of course, the last fellow is Albert Martin. He had quite a way to go. From Massachusetts, of course, was Dr. Amos Pollard. And he went from Massachusetts to New Hampshire to New York to Louisiana and then Gonzales. So right before we get into the story of the Alamo, they're all settled. They're all Texians. They renounced American citizenship. And that's where we begin. And we're going to have different sections of the Alamo I'll be showing here. This is a model. That happens to be actually sort of a section of what the hospital would have been. And we're going to show some different sections here to sort of get an idea of what these folks from New England, what they stood for. Once again, Dave Norton, have a good evening.